Coffee's kind of a dick.
Who, what, where, why? Let's look at how you killed that guy. It's nice to meet you. Who, what, where, why? Let's look at how you did that crime. It's nice to meet you.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Knife to Meet You, the weekly serial killer podcast where we introduce you to a killer that you might not have heard of before. As always, I'm Brian, and with me is Zoe.
Hi, how you doing?
I am doing so good. Happy to be back. How are you doing today, Zoe?
I'm tired, but I'm happy to be here, and I'm excited about today's episode.
Really?
Yes. So today we're going to talk about Dennis Nilsen. If you are in England, you've probably heard of Dennis Nilsen. A lot of people refer to him as the, British Ed Gein, but that's a bullshit title, and whoever says that doesn't really know anything about either Dennis Nilsen or Ed Gein. So,
everyone knows that Henry VIII was the British Ed Gein.
No, that's.
I'm
so... Why do you have to screw with me?
Not with you, just words.
So, okay. I'm gonna paint you a picture here, Brian.
Okay.
It is February 5th, 1983. In a I guess a borough of London. I don't know how London is organized. I don't even know how America's organized. Don't ask me.
America isn't organized, that's how.
Okay, cool. Well, it's a snowy day. It was sleeting the day before. It's cold as shit. I want you to imagine that you are a 30-year-old, well, they call them engineers, but I assume that that's a fancy word for plumber. You're a 30-year-old plumber engineer. Your name is Mike. You work for a company called Dino Rod. You get called in for a small apartment building in a quiet area because their toilets are clogged. And, that's your job, is to take care of that.
Well, I'm an
so,
engineer.
Yeah, because you're a plumbing engineer. That is correct. So, Mike, you get there. It's cold as fuck. And, you open up the manhole cover and you get on in there, and you're looking around. And by all accounts, Mike Catron looks down, looks back up at tenant Jim Alcock and says, "I haven't been in this job for long, but I know this isn't shit." So at first, he suspects the matter was from a rotting animal, but couldn't be sure or what, or how it had come to be there in such quantity. Around 7 p.m., he phones his manager, a guy named Gary Wheeler. I don't have a whole lot of information about Gary Wheeler, but his reaction was to immediately ask if there were Pakistanis in the building.
What?
So, yeah. So just like a little drop of casual racism.
Just 0 to racist, real quick.
Yeah. In the book that I'm reading from by Russ Coffee, which is very good, he says that it sounded like it may have come from a 1970s TV show. Which is like, thank you, Russ. It's a nice color to the story.
It's Back to the Future. The Libyans!
I don't remember that from Back to the Future, but so by that time, all of the occupants of the ground floor, Alcock, a lady named Bridges, a couple more, have been down looking at like what's going on, and the middle floor, I guess, is vacant, and then the top floor is home to Dennis Nilsen. And so Nilsen comes down to see what's going on. And Mike Catron, the plumbing engineer, says that he's going to have to look in daylight, and not to worry, there's probably a perfectly innocent explanation. And he turns to Nilsen and says, "Do you flush dog food down the pan?" And Nilsen replies, "No, he doesn't." So he goes upstairs. He writes a complaining letter to the land people, like the landlords or whatever, about the state of this building, which is unacceptable for living conditions. And he comes back downstairs and finds that Mike the plumber is still there. And before he left, he and Mike and Alcock, the guy who's been out there, he's from the first floor, they all look down at the manhole together, and seeing how much the matter that's causing the clog looks like flesh, Mike says, "This looks like one for the old Bill." Which I think is his way of saying, like, we probably need to call the police or something. I don't know, because I don't know anything about British slang.
Yeah.
I feel like having had 2 very lengthy relationships with Englishmen should have prepared me for this, and yet all it has left me with is some colorful socks and trust issues. So, I don't really know 100% what that means.
The Anglo menace strikes again.
Right. I am, however, grateful for the socks. Nilsen says, "It looks more to me like someone's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." And he goes back to his apartment and, like, considers his options. So first he thinks, well, I guess I could run, but he was a policeman for 8 months, so he knows that he wouldn't get very far. There's nowhere for him to go. And he also considers that he thinks it's a bit cowardly to run. Then he considers suicide, but that scares him. And he was concerned also that if he wrote a suicide note, no one would fucking believe it. So he says that he has to face the music because he, quote, owed it to all the others, unquote, to let their families know what had happened. He's also worried about his dog, Bleep. I don't know who the fuck names their dog Bleep, but apparently Dennis goddamn Nilsen.
I'm sure it was a very sweet and kind dog.
It was, actually. I have quite a bit of information about Bleep. Bleep was black and white and just a very sweet baby. And by all accounts, Dennis Nilsen loved Bleep. Just loved him. Was very good to his dog. So, unfortunately, they put Bleep into a dog's home of some sort after Nilsen was arrested, and Bleep was eventually put down after contracting some sort of illness while there, which I don't really buy, but okay. Doesn't really matter. I mean, what happened to Bleep matters, but I'm saying it doesn't really matter what he decides to do because he knows that the ending is pretty much inevitable. He's pretty well convinced that he's going to be arrested. So he's drinking pretty heavily. He's drinking rum and coke. And around midnight, he's drunk enough to deal with the drain problem. So he goes down to the manhole cover and he clears out particles of white flesh. That's a direct quote. And he disposes them by throwing them over the hedge of the back garden. And then he thought about, what he'd said to Mike Catran, the plumbing engineer, about the chicken pieces. And he thought in the morning he'd go get Kentucky Fried Chicken and to replace what he had removed with thighs and wings. And then he's like, well, is that really necessary, though? Because I feel like everyone's probably lost interest anyway. Like, who fucking cares, right? So, Wednesday, February 9th, he never does buy the chicken. And he'd been spotted that night going outside by Jim Alcock, who questioned him. And Nilsen said he'd been outside for a pee. And Alcock didn't fucking believe him because he and Bridges had listened to Nilsen bang and clatter about with the fucking manhole for 10 goddamn minutes. And then they heard him repeatedly trying to flush the toilet on the landing. So they knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
Oh, man. So then he leaves for work around 7:30 a.m. Mike Catron comes back with his boss Wheeler about an hour later. The only tenant left in the building is Fiona Bridges. So Mike takes his boss over to the manhole. They lift the color. They shine a flashlight down, or as the Brits call it, a torch. And the flesh is gone. So Catron is bewildered. And he's like, I have no doubts about what I saw the night before. Like, you've got to, like, I swear to God, that's what it was, you know?
Yeah.
Which is, of course, like, so typical. Like, you finally bring your boss around to show them this problem that's a serious problem, and then when your boss gets there, problem's gone.
Yeah.
And you look like a fucking asshole.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, boss, the roof
Poor
is
Mike.
You better
Poor
send
Mike
over,
the plumber.
You better send over the handyman. It's like, oh no, it's fine.
So Mike the plumber's bewildered. They walk over to the front of the house where Fiona is, standing in the doorway in her dressing gown, which I think is like a nightgown. So they tell her about the mysterious disappearance of the flesh, and she explains that she and Alcock had seen Nilsen going down into the manhole the night before. So all three of them go back to the drain. Mike Catron reaches in and he pulls out what looks like a human knuckle, and then 3 more pieces of flesh and bone, and then they decide, let's call the fucking police.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Nilsen is at work, and he's absolutely certain this is going to be his last day at work. He places a note in his desk saying that if he were to be reported to have committed suicide, it should not be believed. Someone would have killed him. And despite having been a police constable, Nilsen is paranoid about authority.
Yeah.
But then I guess he became quite cheerful, and he told another author who he worked with 3 different authors. He told another author that it felt like a burden had been lifted. He was tired and prepared for what lay ahead, but also sickened by the past, the present, and a doubtful future. As he left the office, he put on his new bright blue and white scarf. Some colleagues commented on it. In fact, it had belonged to one of his victims, Stephen Sinclair. On Thursday, 3rd of February, 1983, residents of 23 Cranley Gardens in the North London suburb of Muswell Hill found their drains were blocked. So they called the drainage engineer from Dynarod, good old Mike Catron.
Mike again?
No. This is before Mike got there, right?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought
this is 3rd February. I remember I told you we were talking about 5th February, right?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. So on 3rd February, they first reported the blockage. He calls the police, unsure if the pieces are animal or human. 3 officers arrive in a squad car. After peering down in the manhole, all of them agreed that something wasn't right. They fished the pieces of gray matter out from beneath the manhole cover and took them to the lab, and an hour later, the pathologist confirmed them as human. In the mortuary, the detectives knew they were dealing with something hugely significant and particularly grim. So they returned to Cranley Gardens. I'm reading / paraphrasing a lot of this from Dennis Nilsen, Conversations with Britain's Most Evil Serial Killer by Russ Coffee. While I do not always agree with Russ's conclusions, a lot of his information comes from Dennis Nilsen himself, as Coffee was able to, he's like one of 4 people in the world who was able to read the autobiography that Nilsen wrote while he was in prison.
Oh,
and
really?
That was not allowed to be published because
of course.
British law thought that it was pornographic and unseemly, and that there was nothing to be gained from studying any of this. Yeah, because it was the 80s, and people thought that you should just, bottle that shit right up and hide it away, and that's how you deal with serial killers.
So it's not like the American that we have in the state, the concept of not being able to profit off of a crime, but it was just pure obscenity law. That's not the direction I would have assumed it would have been blocked on. But
I mean, it could have been a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I don't know, but what I know is that the formal reason that was given was because it was obscene.
Obscene.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. So they returned to, so I'm going to read a lot from Russ Coffee's book, but what I am going to focus on is the accounts that he includes that are word for word written by Dennis Nilsen himself, and Coffey's contextualization of these memories, given, like, he contextualizes them with other witness statements, facts, police records, and other stuff that we know to be true. But the reason why we have so much detail in terms of, like, even the dialogue and exactly what people said is because this was all written down by multiple people. Okay, so the police returned to Cranley Gardens. An inspection of the exterior of the building indicated that the flesh had come from a pipe that led to the top flat, and neighbors told them that the man who lived there was peculiar and that he should be back from work in about an hour. DCI Peter J. said they would wait, and they are rubbing their hands to keep warm and discussing what they know about Nilsen, his name, his age, and that he worried his neighbors. Still, they had very little idea of what he might be like, and they are concerned, like, how might a man who has possibly been chopping up bodies and flushing them down the toilet react to being arrested? So they're a little nervous, right?
Naturally, yeah.
Meanwhile, Nelson's also at work, and he's waiting, and he basically spent the afternoon, like, mentally preparing himself. So Nelson gets home from work. The police had moved into the lobby because it was too cold to wait outside.
Mhm.
And Nelson opens the door to find DCI J staring at him, and he knowingly returns his gaze. And Jay starts by asking about the plumbing. And Nilsen says, "Since when are the police interested in people's drains?" You know, in his very calm Scottish way. And the policeman suggests that they take the conversation upstairs. So once they're inside Nilsen's flat, Jay explains that they found human remains in the plumbing. And Nilsen just goes, "How awful." And Jay just gets pissed and goes, "Stop messing around. Where's the rest of the body?" And, right, which is like, okay, you know, relatable.
Jumping the gun like a tiny bit, but I mean, I'm
Hey,
with
man,
you.
it worked. In a matter-of-fact way, Nilsen just takes them to the damp, cold front room of his apartment and opens up one of the wardrobes where he had stored bodies.
Mhm.
And he just tells them that he's got a lot more to say, and he wants to do it down at the station. So, in the car, back to the Hornsey police station, the detectives ask their prisoner what it was he wanted to tell them. Had he killed 2 men? And Nilsen says, 15 or 16 over 4 years. And
Just matter of fact.
yeah, and that statement alone makes him the most prolific multiple killer yet to be discovered in the UK at that time.
Mhm.
And he's just quiet, intelligent, personable, and he's just, I mean, for a serial killer, he's incredibly, like, helpful, talkative, intelligent, and one of the few killers who I personally feel genuinely wants to understand his own psychology. Like, I don't think Dennis Nilsen understands why he's done the things that he's done, but I do think he wants to know. So, in Nilsen's version of the events of his arrest, he emphasizes himself at the center looking for help and says that the police were unsure of themselves and that it was he who finally got tired of concealing his problem and led the police each step of the way with his sudden, immediate, and full cooperation. Honestly, though, his account is corroborated by a few other sources, so I don't know why Coffee is, like, making it sound like Nilsen's, you know, trumping himself up here. I don't like, that's okay. Either way, the evidence is that 3 young men had been senselessly murdered in that particular flat, Coffee writes. And what really got him caught was that he had moved to this new place and no longer had the ability to dispose of the bodies as he had done at his previous place of living.
Mhm.
So he had only killed 3 people there because he got caught. In his previous place, he'd killed 9.
So, inconvenience prevented him from killing more.
No, inconvenience caused him to get caught. I don't necessarily feel that the inconvenience altered his killing pattern. I'm going to start with what the police find, okay? But this is the crime scene that they do find, because until this point, there had been no other crime scene, you understand. The police had no idea what he was doing. And so this is the only crime scene,
Right.
even though it is not necessarily the beginning of the story.
Yes, this is the one. Was it Carnsby Gardens?
Cranley Gardens.
Cranley Gardens, so close. Cranley Gardens is the only crime scene they have, regardless of other crimes having been committed.
I mean, I'm sure they go back to his other home
But
and dig up all that other
at this
shit.
second,
but
yeah.
This is, yeah. In the wardrobe that Nilsen had led the police to were bin bags filled with the remains of a Scottish youth named Stephen Sinclair. Nilsen had killed him 2 weeks earlier, and now he wanted to explain everything. Coffee writes the way he did so was distinctive. He talked almost as if he had been in love with Sinclair. In one notebook, Nilsen wrote, "I stood in great grief and a wave of utter sadness, as if someone very dear to me had just died." The line was written next to an ink drawing of the corpse called "The Last Time I Saw Stephen Sinclair." The juxtaposition seemed quite mad, he says. The affection he claimed to have felt for the young man was matched with a vile disregard for his body. The torso had been cut down the middle and was separated into two halves, which, holy shit, that's a difficult thing to do. The lower part of the body had been removed with a clean cut from just above the waist. The eyes had been boiled in their sockets, and when the pieces were reassembled on the mortuary slab, they had turned different colors.
Oh my god.
Yes.
So there's multiple methods of
Disposal.
Yeah, but it's kind of like he was torturing the body after it had been dead.
Oh, no, not at all.
No?
No. When Nilsen had worked, he was a cook in the military for a number of years, and they had taught him how to butcher, and so that was the most effective way to get rid of the body. And it was so distasteful to him to have to get rid of the bodies after the fact that he would have to get himself good and drunk on rum and coke to actually work up the nerve to do it. And then he would often become too drunk to finish the work. And so it was that he had to do it in multiple different stages, you see.
Wow. Okay, so he's got. That's interesting because that kind of adds to his.
The whole thing is interesting. Let me take you on a journey, okay? I'm going to walk you through one of his murders, which is typical of his pattern, okay?
Okay.
And some of this is actually written in Nilsen's own words, which we have never had before on this podcast, and I'm actually really grateful to have the information, because the way that he writes it paints a picture that I don't think an analyst could really give you the same perspective. And I feel like we learned so much more about him from his own words than we would by anyone else's. I mean, 3 different authors interviewed him extensively, had him fill out paperwork, read his written autobiography, and produced novels about him. Not novels, but books about him. And, he corresponded with one of them for at least 8 years after the book was written, before he decided that he felt that the author was just like exploiting him, and then stopped talking to the guy. But I feel like each of the authors came to 3 separate conclusions about Nilsen.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that every different source that I consulted for the research of this episode had a different kind of stance from which they presented all the evidence. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how people write about themselves. I mean, certainly as we're since the internet age, we have a lot more of that. A lot of you see it a lot more with spree killers who write manifestos, and cults and things like that have a lot of documentation. So it's incredibly valuable to have a killer's writing because even in interviews, there's only so much you can glean. Writing has the potential to reveal so much more.
To be clear, he was arrested in 83. Internet was not a big thing at the time. His autobiography was never released to the public. His 55 analyses that he filled out never released to the public. None of this is available online. I was only able to get this from an actual book written by an author who had access to those documents and summarized and quoted them.
Yes, I was just making the point that it is something that we have more readily available today, and the fact that we have this going back, nigh on 40 years.
Oh, it's an incredible wealth of information. I just wanted to
Absolutely.
clarify in case any of our listeners were like, I'm going to get on the internet and read his autobiography. Sorry, you can't.
No, you can't. But you can find the one tabletop RPG that was written by a Swedish murderer.
Why do you just drop bombs on me like that so casually when we're talking? Like, I'm sorry, you're going to need to expand on that.
Okay, so
Please elaborate.
So there was a guy in Sweden who was a member of some kind of militia who ended up killing a few people. And as part of his, one of the things that he did in prison to pass the time was he wrote a tabletop role-playing game. It has never been published by a proper publisher because, you don't really want to publish a murder game. But it's out there. You can find it. It's not very good. It's honestly kind of dull. And what a lot of people in the TTRPG community would call a heartbreaker, because he's essentially just trying to remake. He saw 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, and I can do better.
Oh yeah, of course you can do better than Dungeons and Dragons.
Here are the 800.
It's only been the most popular, long-lasting, distinguished, and evolving piece of role playing. Okay, you know what? This is we've digressed into a rant about how much Dungeons and Dragons is the standard, the gold standard.
But my game has 85 kinds of spears. There are 7 kinds of bec de corban.
I like how your impression of this guy makes him sound like he's being played by oh shit, what's his name? He was in The Birdcage. He's on Modern Family as a guest star. Nathan Lane, yes. You make him sound like he's being played in a biopic by Nathan Lane.
Listen, anything that Nathan Lane wants to show up in, I'm pretty much down for.
Somehow, though, because I find Nathan Lane to be so funny and relatable and sweet and kind, I just love him. I'm suddenly endeared to this Swedish killer, which is not the impression you want to give.
No, because the way the movie's going to work, it's going to be about a guy in prison writing a role-playing game, and you don't learn that he's a murderer till the very end.
Big yikes. All right, let's get back into it. Stephen Sinclair was typical of those that Nilsen would bring home. He was the sort whose story interests no one, and the kind of young man that Nilsen felt he could take under his wing. Sinclair was 20 years old and only 5'5". He had come down from Scotland, traveling without a ticket on the Intercity Express from Edinburgh to London's King's Cross. Like many of the runaways who arrived at that station, he had come with little more than a vague feeling that the big city had something for everyone, including him. Sinclair met his killer on Wednesday, 26th of January. Nilsen isn't sure exactly where. In one version, it was a pub called the Royal George in Goslet Park near Denmark Street, where he had once worked. One witness, however, thought he saw Sinclair hanging around with someone fitting Nilsen's description some days before, so despite what he says, Nilsen did quite possibly mark Sinclair out as a potential victim beforehand. Another more likely account has them meeting by the slot machines off Piccadilly Circus. This was then a well-known gay cruising area where older men would try to pick up rent boys or runaways looking for money. Dressed in a leather jacket, tight black jeans, and with tattoos on his hands and arms, Sinclair would have hardly stood out. As a well-spoken man in his late 30s, neither would Nilsen. Nilsen was 6'1", slim, dark-haired, and good-looking despite his oversized glasses and functional suit. I almost said fictional suit. And a suit that didn't exist.
This
Um,
man's wearing a suit made of rainbows.
the Emperor's suit.
The Emperor's suit,
Um,
yeah.
we shouldn't be laughing. This is very terrible. But we know from victims who escaped that Nilsen's manner when picking up people was usually friendly but dominating. The conversation between Sinclair and Nilsen was therefore probably one-sided, with their shared knowledge of Eastern Scotland helping it along. I don't like how much conjecture and just pure supposition that Coffee puts into this article here. He talks about, not article, book, he talks about what they would have talked about. And
he's narrativizing a lot.
yeah, and I'm not fond of it, so we're gonna skip ahead. One of my favorite things about this source material, though, is that it has one of the most information about this victim than any other podcast episode we've done so far. I scour looking for information on the victim, which I recently heard another podcaster say that, oh no, it was YouTuber Bailey Sarian, who I absolutely adore, but I do listen to a lot of other crime podcasts. And it seems like some people think that we should shine more light on the victims instead of glorifying the killers. But I also think, like, listen, why are we putting so much information about the victims out there? Like, we just kind of want to give them and their families peace. It is not the object of this podcast in any way to glorify any killer, but my firm belief that we need to study these assholes in order to catch them, in order to understand them. There is science to be done here. There is studying to be done. And admittedly, it's not the most perfect method of study in that every single case happens to be a case study, you know? But I do think that from every killer we look at, there's something to be learned. And I try to present as much information as possible. I also just personally find this shit interesting. And you may think that that's a very morbid curiosity there. Sure, fine. You can judge me all you want, all day. But I do know that it was studying these killers that gave birth to the behavioral analysis unit of the FBI and allowed the feds to start catching these people. So you can think it's inappropriate all you want, or obscene all you want, or morbid all you want. This is how you catch killers.
It's how you turn Jack the Ripper into Jack the guy who's in jail for the rest of his life.
Precisely.
Like you're
and I think it's also how I think also understanding their patterns, how they function, that's how you educate the public, the general public, which is you, dear listener, about how these guys operate, so that hopefully we can help you protect yourselves from these assholes. This is why we have, safety tips when we, think of them, we throw them in there. And why we try to give so much information about how these people get their victims.
Being able to study the behavioral patterns of serial killers is
invaluable.
Invaluable, absolutely. And I, from my perspective, the most valuable part of that is that demythologizing. Because
yes.
When you are able to take something that is a person or an event or a series of events that is scary, and you're able to ground it, then it becomes less scary and it becomes less dangerous because people are aware of what they have to look out for.
And I think also, conversely, making it more real, makes people be aware that this could happen to them. It could happen to anyone. And, we need to be on our guard and we need to be looking out for one another.
Yeah, absolutely.
Arguably, though, it is my own fear of serial killers that makes me feel the need to understand them and pull them apart. A lot of the times when I, have something that keeps me up at night, I have to look at it. I have to stare at it in the face, and maybe that's why I'm obsessed, but here we are either way.
And here you are too, listener.
Yeah. Welcome. We're all mad here.
That's okay, the best kind of people are.
This is very true. So Sinclair would have seemed like a safe bet in terms of a victim. Not only was he a runaway, but he had also just been in trouble. He had been caught stealing at St. Mungo's Hostel, which is the best name for a fucking hostel I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, it's gotta tell.
And
Is he friends with the Herculoid Saint Mungo?
I don't know what that is. But here Coffee says that, quote, he bailed to appear before magistrates. To me, either that means it was a typo and he failed to appear, or that he made bail and was going to appear before magistrates later.
I have heard bail used as a verb in UK before, so
So this whole section here is about Stephen Sinclair. I'm sure you've noticed by now. Coffee's kind of a dick. I'd like to point out that this guy was, I mean, he said 9 victims in the first house, 3 in the next, so I guess he was victim number 12, and Nilsen's last and final victim. And Coffee just, like, doesn't care. Like, the whole don't speak ill of the dead thing, run out the window. So I'm going to read this, or paraphrase this, from the novel, but I just want to preface it by saying that I feel like he could have been a little bit fucking nicer in presenting this. Like, he could have soft-gloved it a little bit, and he chose not to. So, as I said, Sinclair was a safe bet because he was a runaway, but he had also just been arrested for stealing. And Coffee says, it was hardly the first time Sinclair had gotten himself into bother. In fact, he'd rarely been out of trouble since he was born Stephen Guild in 19. He was illegitimate and was soon taken into the custody of the local authorities. After 14 months old, he was put up in foster care and came into the home of Neil and Elizabeth Sinclair, who adopted him to be a brother to their 3 daughters. Stephen Sinclair, however, wet his bed and constantly bunked off school. Things became so bad that a doctor's advice was sought, and it was transpired that he had motor epilepsy. He was then institutionalized until he was 12. By his mid-teens, he was also diagnosed as educationally subnormal and spent time in Borstal. I don't know what that is. Then it says he soon graduated to prison. I don't know how he goes from institutionalization to prison, but...
Do you get a cap and gown?
No, listen, like, it sounds to me like this is a kid who was not wanted from the beginning, and then even after he was adopted, his parents were like, oh, we got a lemon. He pees the bed because he had epilepsy. And clearly had a learning disorder. And his adoptive parents, it sounds to me like, just shipped him off into probably terrible conditions. It was the 60s. When he got out, things became worse, although Coffee does not elaborate on how. On one occasion, he slashed his wrists. On another, he attacked his sisters, and there was also an occasion where he tried to burn the house down. Eventually, Sinclair was refostered into a new family, but the same old problems rose to the surface. By the time he turned 18, he was a drug addict, a glue sniffer, and a recognized opportunist criminal. At this time, though, there is no particular indication he was homosexual, as if that's fucking relevant to anything. Yeah, I'm not sure when this book was published, but probably a while ago, just judging by the super judgmental fucking way Coffee narrates.
Yeah, it's like, it's on the border of, if not victim blaming.
Super duper victim blaming. I mean, I don't condone theft and attacking your sisters and, trying to burn the house down, but it sounds to me
not.
Stephen Sinclair was a kid who was unwanted and tossed around from person to person and very likely mistreated and, struggled all his life. And I feel really bad for him. And then he ends up fucking getting murdered. Like, just the cherry on the shit sundae that is this poor kid's life.
Yeah, like they gave him a medical diagnosis telling him he wasn't normal. Like, what do you think is going to happen to a kid
the fact that they institutionalized him rather than taking care of him is just
Yeah. Again, we're talking about a '60s psychiatric institution, which is basically one step above a tuberculosis asylum. Like,
Yeah.
it,
Well,
ugh.
so by 18, he's a drug addict and a criminal. And however they met, we know that he met Dennis Nilsen when he was 20, I believe, 20 years old,
Right.
which
He was
is
20.
just
He was
like
20
a
when he
baby.
stowed away. Yeah,
He was 20 when he what?
when he was stowed away and arrived in London.
Oh, yeah, because he's traveling without a ticket. Okay. I
Yes.
guess you could
Yes.
consider that a stowaway. But,
Well,
like,
I mean, I
in
think
my mind, when you say stowaway, he has climbed inside a barrel on a ship and is, like, hiding there during the journey.
well,
And
yeah.
and all the sailors on the ship believe the ship to be haunted. And, yeah.
It's the ghostly Scottish barrel. It is.
God. Okay. Wherever they met, we know that soon afterwards, Nilsen invited Sinclair on a tour of the West End pubs. He bought him anything he cared to drink and insisted on being called Des, explaining that he hated the name Dennis. At closing time, around 11:30 p.m., Nilsen suggested they go back to his flat for more alcohol. In Nilsen's unpublished autobiography, History of a Drowning Boy, he describes their journey home, what line they took, what route they traveled home, where they walked.
Okay, so he's got a memory of like exactly what happened. So
Yes.
he knows down to like the
Well,
subway route they took.
just hold on. You jumped the gun. You need to just reel it back a little bit.
Okay.
So they go inside, they go up the 2 flights of stairs to the attic apartment. Nilsen opens up the door and Bleep, his small black and white crossbreed dog, jumps up and licks their hands. And, I mean, Coffee describes the apartment here, which I don't feel is necessarily... to me, that's, like, not at all important.
Yeah.
But I did want to say that the cooker, cooking pot, and bath have now been preserved in Scotland Yard's Black Museum as a permanent reminder of the state of the mind of the young man who had owned them. And I'm like, so that's what you keep. You keep his fucking cook pot in his bathtub as a murder souvenir. I mean, who's glorifying this shit now? You're taking fucking trophies, okay? But you don't
Yeah,
want to look at
that's
any of the
kind of
information
weird.
related to his psychology. It's so
Yeah.
fucked up. It's
Like,
so fucked up.
the police taking killer trophies. That's bizarre. That's wow.
Yeah, and preserving them in a museum.
Yeah.
You want to talk to me about glorifying serial killers?
Like some docent has to
Serial
learn
killer
about all of these things.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
There are a number of accounts of what happened next, even before the writing of History of a Drowning Boy Nilsen had given to. The first was his confession to the police, in which he told DCIJ that when he came in and put on the television, he was pleased to see a working class drama titled Boys from the Black Stuff being broadcasted, and they sat and drank alcohol and TV. Towards the end of the program, Nilsen noticed that Sinclair had disappeared to the corner of the room to inject himself with drugs, which disappointed Nilsen. And he put The Who's Tommy on his stereo with his headphones tightly clasped to his ears, and he says that he listened to all 75 minutes of the dozing off. In a police statement later, he claimed, "I can't remember anything else until I woke up the next morning. He was still in the armchair and he was dead. On the floor was a piece of string with a tie attached to it. I know I must have killed him. I must have made up the piece of string that night. I don't know." Months later, after the trial, Nilsen wrote an account for an author, Brian Masters, which is reproduced in his book Killing for Company, extracts of which are reproduced in Coffee's book with special permission. So this is in Nilsen's words exactly. "I am sitting cross-legged on the carpet, drinking and listening to music. I drain my glass and take the phones off. Behind me sits Stephen Sinclair on the lazy chair. He was crashed out with a drink and drugs. I sit and look at him. I stand up and approach him. My heart is pounding. I kneel down in front of him. I touch his leg and say, "Are you awake?" There is no response. Oh, Stephen, I think. Here I go again. I get up and go slowly and casually through the kitchen. I take some thick string from the drawer and put it on the stainless steel draining board. Not long enough, I think. I go to the cupboard in the front room and search inside. On the floor therein, I find an old tie. I cut a bit off and throw the rest away. I go back into the kitchen and make up the ligature. I look into the back room and Stephen has not stirred. Bleep comes in and I speak to her and scratch her head. "Leave me just now, Bleep. Get your head down. Everything's all right." I was relaxed. I never contemplated morality. This was something which I had to do. I knotted the string because I heard somewhere that this was what the Thuggee did in India, I don't know, for a quicker kill. I walked back into the room. I draped the ligature over one of his knees and poured myself another drink. My heart was pounding very fast. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Stephen. I thought to myself, all that potential, all that beauty, and all that pain that is his life. I have to stop him. It will soon be over. I did not feel bad. I did not feel evil. I walked over to him. I removed the scarf. I picked up one of his wrists and let go. His limp arm flopped back onto his lap. I opened one of his eyes and there was no reflex. He was deeply unconscious. I took the ligature and put it around his neck. I knelt by the side of the chair and faced the wall. I took each loose end of the ligature and pulled it tight. I held him there for a couple of minutes. He was limp and stayed that way. I released my hold and removed the string and tie. He had stopped. I spoke to him. "Stephen, that didn't hurt at all. Nothing can touch me." I ran my fingers through his bleached blonde hair. His face looked peaceful. He was dead. The front of his jeans was wet with urine. I got up and had a drink and a cigarette. He made no noise. I had to wash his soiled body. I ran a bath. I returned and began to undress him. I took off his leather jacket, jersey, and t-shirt, then his running shoes and socks. I had difficulty with his tight, wet jeans. He still sat there, now naked, in the armchair. His body was pale and hairless. He had crepe bandages on both forearms. I removed those to reveal deep, open, recent razor cuts. He had very recently tried to commit suicide. I picked up his limp body in my arms and carried it into the bathroom. I put it into the half-filled bath. I washed the body. I sat him on the white and blue dining chair. I sat down, took a cigarette and a drink, and looked at him. His eyes were not quite closed. "Stephen," I thought, "you're another problem for me. What am I going to do with you? I've run out of room." The next morning, I lay beside him and placed the large mirror at the end of the bed. I stripped and lay there staring at both our naked bodies in the mirror. He looked paler than I did. I put talcum powder on myself and lay down again. We looked similar now. I spoke to him as if he were still alive. I thought how beautiful he looked and how beautiful I looked. He just looked fabulous. I stared at us both in the mirror. Soon I felt tired. I got in between the sheets. "Good night, Stephen," I said, and switched off the bedside light and went to sleep. I was up a few hours later. It was an ordinary day of work ahead for me.
Wow. Um,
Yep. Mm-hmm. Um, that ordinary day at work was as an executive officer. I don't really know what that means. At the nearby Kentish Town Job Center. Nilsen had been in the job for less than a year. For the previous 7 years, he had worked in a junior role at the Denmark Street Job Center. Don't know what that is either. Prior to that, he'd been a security guard, a policeman for 8 months, and a cook in the army. But although he had joined the army aged 15, he still seemed highly educated. Here I would like to kind of go in media res a little bit. I'd like to pause kind of where we're at and back up a bit. So Nilsen killed his first victim, 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, on the 30th of December, 1978, as far as we know. I'm going to be reading paraphrasing now from Wikipedia because I do not have access to Brian Masters' 1985 Killing for Company, The Case of Dennis Nilsen, but some of the information in his book has been cited or copied in whole or in part in this Wikipedia article. So I'm basically giving you information from Masters via Wikipedia. Um, a lot of the information between Coffee and Masters overlaps because they were sharing their information, which I think is the best way in order to, pool your resources to have the most possible information. Holmes encountered Nilsen in the Cricklewood Arms pub, where Holmes had unsuccessfully attempted to purchase alcohol, because he's 14. According to Nilsen, he'd been drinking heavily alone on the day he met Holmes before deciding in the evening that he must at all costs leave his flat and seek company. Nilsen invited Holmes to his house with the promise of the two drinking alcohol and listening to music, believing him to be approximately 17 years old. At Nilsen's home, both he and Holmes drank heavily before they fell asleep. The following morning, Wilson awoke to find Holmes asleep on his bed. In his subsequent written confessions, Nilsen stated that he was afraid to wake him in case he left me. After caressing the sleeping youth, Nilsen decided Holmes was to stay with me over the new year whether he wanted to or not. Reaching for a necktie, Nilsen straddled Holmes as he strangled him into unconsciousness, and once he was unconscious, he drowned the teenager in a bucket filled with water. Nilsen then washed the body in his bathtub before placing Holmes on his bed and caressing his body. He masturbated over the body twice before awaiting the passing of rigor mortis to enable him to stow the corpse beneath his floorboards, which is very Edgar Allan Poe. Holmes's bound corpse remained beneath the floorboards for almost 8 months before Nilsen built a bonfire in the garden flat and burned the body on 11th of August 1960. Reflecting on his killing spree in 1983, Nilsen stated that having killed Holmes, quote, "I caused dreams, which caused death. This is my crime," adding that he had started down the avenue of death in possession of a new kind of flatmate. Nilsen's written recollections of the ritual he observed in the murder of his victim also say, "I eased him into his new bed," which is beneath the floorboards. "A week later, I wondered whether his body had changed at all or had started to decompose. I disinterred him and pulled the dirt-stained youth up onto the floor. His skin was very dirty. I stripped myself naked and carried him into the bathroom with the body. There was practically no discoloration, and his skin was pale white. His limbs were more relaxed than when I had put him down." You'll see that this kind of follows a pattern where he often strangles the victims in bed or, wherever they are unconscious or something, and he ritualistically cleans them, usually because they've soiled themselves. And he will store them somewhere, often beneath the floorboards, and then he will remove them and pose them to keep him company. They'll watch TV together and share a meal, and he talks to them.
I kind of had questions about that when you mentioned the book titled Killing for Company.
Yes.
A
lot of people believe that, and he has said that, his primary motive for killing was the fear that his companion would then leave him.
So, okay, so he kept it for 8 months as company and then burned it in the bonfire.
Yes, in 1970.
Right.
October 11th, 1979, Nilsen attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho, whom he had met in St. Martin's Lane's pub, and lured to his flat on the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle Ho, who managed to flee from his flat and reported the incident to police. Nilsen was questioned in relation to the incident, but Ho decided not to press charges. 2 months later, on December 3rd, Nilsen encountered a 23-year-old Canadian student named Kenneth Ockenden, who had been on tour of England visiting relatives. Nilsen encountered Ockenden as they both drank in a West End. Learning that the youth was a tourist, Nilsen offered to show Ockenden several London landmarks, an offer which Ockenden accepted. Nilsen then invited the youth to his house on the promise of a meal and further drinks. They stop off at some place to purchase alcohol. They get whiskey, rum, and beer, and Ockenden insists on sharing the bill. Oh, it's apparently a type of liquor store that predominantly sells prepackaged liquors, typically in bottles intended to be consumed off of the store's premises. Okay, they just
Okay.
have like a special word for it, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Off license, off license, I don't know.
Well, probably off license, because it's, you probably need a special kind of license to be able to drink inside of a building.
Who knows? In any case, Nilsen was adamant that he could not recall the precise moment that he strangled Ockenden, but recalled that he strangled the youth with the cord of his headphones as Ockenden listened to music. He also remembered dragging the youth across his floor with the wire wrapped around his neck as he strangled him before pouring himself half a glass of rum and continuing to listen to music on the headphones with which he had strangled Ockenden. And the following day, he purchased a Polaroid camera and photographed Ockenden's body in various suggestive positions. He then laid Ockenden's corpse spread eagle above him on his bed as he watched television for several hours, before wrapping the body in plastic bags and stowing the corpse beneath the floorboards. On approximately 4 occasions over the following fortnight, Nilsen disinterred Ockenden's body from beneath the floorboards and seated the body upon his armchair alongside himself as he watched television and drank alcohol. So, yeah. You can definitely see he's got a distinctive pattern.
Yes.
Nilsen killed his third victim, 16-year-old Martin Duffy, on the 17th of May in 1980. Duffy was a catering student from Birkenhead, Merseyside, who had hitched to London without his parents' knowledge on May 13th after being questioned by the British Transport Police for evading his train fare. I am pronouncing all of these on the fly. I am very likely fucking them all up. I do not care. I don't feel like they are relevant to the story unless you live there and know the places, in which case, if you're, in Birkenhead right now and you're like, it's pronounced Birkenhead, fuck you, Americans, then you know what I'm talking about. You know what I meant. Stop being a dickhead.
Or a bell end, as they might say in the UK.
Thank you for adding that color. I just know that there are so many different
color spelled with a U, by the way.
I just know that there are so many true crime podcasts and YouTubers who get messages from people telling them, oh, you've pronounced this wrong. And I just want to preempt all of those messages by saying, I don't care. I don't find that it's particularly relevant to the story unless you need to know the precise location, in which case I've pronounced it in such a way that I think you could probably Google it. So for 4 days, Duffy had slept rough. I don't really know what that means. I assume on the street near Euston Railway Station before Nilsen encountered him as he returned from a union conference in Southport. Nilsen recalled him as being both exhausted and hungry and happily accepted Nilsen's offer of a meal and a bed for the evening. After he had fallen asleep in Nilsen's bed, Nilsen fashioned a ligature around his neck and then simultaneously sat on Duffy's chest and tightened the ligature with, quote, great force. Nilsen held this grip until Duffy became unconscious. Then he dragged the boy into his kitchen and drowned him in the sink before bathing the body, which he recollected as being the youngest looking he'd ever seen. Duffy's body was first placed upon a kitchen chair, then upon the bed on which he'd been strangled. Nilsen repeatedly kissed him, complimented and caressed him, both before and after he masturbated while standing upon the stomach of the corpse. For 2 days, Duffy's body was stowed in a cupboard before Nilsen noted signs of bloating. Therefore, he went straight under the floorboards. Following Duffy's murder, Nilsen began to kill with increasing frequency. He's ramping up before the end of 1980. He killed a further 5 victims and attempted to murder 1 other. Only one of these victims whom Nilsen murdered, 26-year-old William David Sutherland, has ever been identified. Yes. Nilsen's recollections of the unidentified victims were vague. He graphically recalled how each victim had been murdered and just how long the body had been cleaned before dissection. One unidentified victim in November had moved his legs in cycling motion as he strangled. Nilsen apparently was out from work between the 11th and the 18th of November, likely because of this particular murder. And another unidentified victim, Nilsen had unsuccessfully attempted to resuscitate before sinking to his knees and sobbing, before standing to expressly spit at his own image as he looked at himself in the mirror. On another occasion, he had lain in bed alongside the body of an unidentified victim as he listened to the classical theme Fanfare for the Common Man, before bursting into tears. It's a musical work by the American composer. Before Nilsen died in 2018, he did genuinely try to have police identify all of his unidentified victims. Unfortunately, they were unable to figure out who these men were, but it wasn't for lack of. Inevitably, the accumulated bodies beneath Nilsen's floorboards attracted insects and created a foul odor, particularly throughout the summer. On occasions when Nilsen disinterred his victims from beneath the floorboards, he noted that the bodies were covered with insects and maggots. I'm not going to elaborate more on some of that mass here. He did place deodorants beneath the floorboards and sprayed insecticide about the flat twice daily. The odor of decay and the presence of flies remained. In late 1980, Nilsen removed and dissected the bodies of each victim killed since December 1979 and burned them on a communal bonfire that he constructed on waste ground behind his apartment building.
Oh my god.
To disguise the smell of the burning flesh of the 6 dissected bodies placed upon this pyre, Nilsen crowned the bonfire with an old car tire. 3 neighborhood children stood to watch this particular bonfire, and Nilsen later wrote in his memoirs that he felt it would have seemed in order if he had seen these 3 children dancing around a mass funeral pyre. It's just so fucking ridiculous. When the bonfire had been reduced to ashes and cinders, Nilsen used a rake to search the debris for any recognizable bones. He found a skull, which was still intact, and he smashed it to pieces with the rake. I imagine it was probably much more brittle because of the fire.
Yeah.
On or about January 4th of 1981, Nilsen encountered an unidentified man whom he described for investigators as 18 years old, blue-eyed, young Scot. Oh, as an 18-year-old, blue-eyed, young Scot. At the Golden Lion pub in Soho, he was lured into Melrose Avenue upon the promise of partaking in a drinking contest. After Nilsen and his victim had consumed several beverages, Nilsen strangled him with a tie and subsequently placed the body beneath the floorboards. Nilsen informed his employers that he was ill and unable to attend work on January 12th in order that he could dissect both his victim and another unidentified victim that he had killed approximately 1 month before that. By April, Nilsen had killed 2 further unidentified victims, one of whom he described as an English skinhead whom he had met in... I know I said I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. You can't make me care. Just say it. Just pick away and just say it. Leicester Square? Leicester?
Lister?
Sure. The other he described as a Belfast boy, a man in his early 20s. 20s? My eyelids started twitching just then as well. Clearly, the Leicester Square caused me so much stress that my eyelids started to twitch. I don't care. Okay. My whole thing in life is to say that I don't care and then try as hard as humanly possible while saying through gritted teeth, I don't care. Oh my god.
Who says I care?
This is awful, and I'm trying not to make any jokes because it's just like a list of poor young boys who I can't even give you their names, Brian. I don't even know who these guys were. This is all we have of them.
Yeah. It's that people can just disappear.
So
Okay.
the other he described as a Belfast boy, a man in his early 20s, approximately 5'9", whom he had murdered sometime in February. In relation to the first of these 3 unidentified victims, he later casually reflected, "End of the day, end of the drink, end of a person, floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street." Um, you can see with a lot of his remarks like this, and a lot of the psychologists who, examined him, the authors who worked with him and corresponded with him at length, and through his own memoirs and assessments, that he just has no remorse. He really doesn't. But I do think that what he did scared him.
Yeah.
And I think a notable need why he behaved in these ways. But I don't think he regretted it. I think he just understood that it was compulsion he had to do, and he had to do it, and that was that for him. Like, for him, it was just like, well, I had to, so there.
Yeah, he's detached.
Yes. But I do think that he knew enough to be afraid of what he'd done. And there is a distinctive level of self-loathing in there, somewhat, which is interesting. Not a lot of psychopaths have that.
Yeah, it's not narcissism, it's...
He differs from typical serial killer patterns in so many ways, and that's why I chose to do an episode about him, even though he's fairly well known in England. Mostly because we don't know who he is in America, or most people wouldn't know who he is in America. And also because it pissed me off that they compared him to Ed Gein, who I'm never going to do a podcast episode about because he's so well known. The fact that they're saying that he's the English Ed Gein, like, this guy isn't sitting around making lampshades out of people or nipple belts, okay? He's posing them and having dinner with them and watching TV with them and drinking with them. And
Yeah.
he treats them and their bodies as though, like, with the utmost affection. Very different from a man who cannibalized his victim, okay? Which, to my knowledge, Dennis Nilsen never did.
No,
I do want to say, though, that I think Dennis Nilsen is being portrayed by David Tennant in a show that's come out recently. I don't know the name of the show or when it came out or who did it or anything. Portrayed by David Tennant, and I've seen a side-by-side comparison of him in costume, and he really not like him.
Wow.
It bothers me so much. I don't like it that David Tennant is, like, now rebelling against his Doctor Who time by playing every villain he possibly can. Because for me, I'm like, no! But it's not for me to tell David Tennant how to live his life or how to construct his career. If he wants to play villains, he can play villains. That's obviously his thing.
I mean, listen, they could bring him back as the Master for Jodie Whittaker to go up against. That'd be kind of cool.
No.
Okay.
Would not be cool. 50% of this podcast is Brian just saying, and we could do this, or so and so could do that, and me just going, no, like an intransigent 3-year-old. Like,
intransigent? A 3-year-old that exists between states of reality?
No, intransigent being stubborn and immovable.
Oh, what am I thinking of?
I don't know.
Did I think you said intangible?
Yep.
I think I heard you say an intangible 3-year-old in my head. It was like, that's even scarier.
Yes, a mystical disembodied 3-year-old.
Man, nuggets!
The following month, Nilsen removed the internal organs of several victims stowed beneath his floorboards. He discarded these innards both upon the waste ground behind his flat and in his household rubbish, which is just the trash can. The final victim to be murdered at Melrose Avenue was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow, whom Nilsen discovered slumped against a wall outside his home on September 17th of 1981. When Nilsen inquired as to Barlow's welfare, he was informed that medication that Barlow was prescribed for his epilepsy had caused his legs to weaken. And Nilsen suggested that Barlow should be in a hospital, and supporting him walked him to his residence before phoning for an ambulance. The following day, Barlow was released from hospital and returned to Nilsen's home, apparently to thank him. He was invited in, and after eating a meal, began drinking rum and coke before falling asleep on the sofa. Nilsen manually strangled Barlow as he slept before stowing his body beneath his kitchen sink the following morning. In mid-1981, Nilsen's landlord decided to renovate 195 Melrose Avenue and asked Nilsen to vacate the property. Nilsen was initially resistant to the proposal, but accepted an offer of £1,000 from the landlord to vacate the residence, and then he moved into the attic flat at 23D Cranley Gardens in the Muswell Hill district of North London on October 5th of 1981. The day before he vacated the property, Nilsen burned the dissected bodies of the last 5 victims he had killed at this address upon a third and final bonfire that he constructed in the garden behind his flat. Again, Nilsen ensured the bonfire was crowned with an old car tire to disguise the smell of burning flesh. And Nilsen had already dissected the bodies of 4 of these victims in January and August and only needed to complete the dissection of Barlow for the third bonfire. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Brian. I've not always been a mathematically inclined girl. I know I am now a math tutor. We're going to completely disregard that. But, okay, 3 different bonfires, right?
Yeah.
In the first bonfire, we had...
Holmes was one bonfire.
Okay.
And then he had a second bonfire, which was a group of ones from a certain point onward.
Right. So
it was one in one.
So in late 1980, Nilsen dissected and removed and dissected the bodies of each victim. And so it was 6 bodies. Okay, so first bonfire, 1 body. Second bonfire, 6 bodies. Okay, so that's 7. And then the final bonfire was the day before. He had already dissected the bodies of 4 of the victims. And so he burned 5 victims, the last 5 victims. So 5 plus 7.
12.
Which is at odds with the number that Coffee gave in his book, which I was reading from earlier, said that he had killed 9 bodies at his first home, and then 3 at Cranley Gardens, for a total of 12.
And
but from our count here, yes, and all of this is from Masters and also Bill Waddell's The Black Museum, New Scotland Yard. Bill Waddell, I believe, his book was about the Black Museum, Scotland Yard's museum of the things that they had kept from various crimes, which included, his cooking pot and bathtub. And so he was one of many different people that Waddell had interviewed for his 1993 book. So, we've got one of 3 different main sources here. And the Wikipedia article is composed mainly of Waddell and Masters, whereas earlier I was reading from Coffee, obviously.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a kind of disparity between how many people he actually killed. And given that these people are all named and described here, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is the more accurate number.
Yeah, well, Nilsen said in the card to the cops when they first picked him up, he said 15 to 16.
Yes.
So I don't know where Coffee got his number.
Who the fuck knows? I don't know. Coffee seems to me like not the most... Normally I'm trash talking the serial killer on our episodes, but I guess this episode of Nice to Meet You, I'm just trash talking Coffee. Sorry, Russ. You did your best.
Yeah, maybe. We don't know that for sure.
What I want to talk about here, in between the different places that he lived, his Melrose Avenue home, where he lived in the attic apartment, he had moved in there with a man named David Gallichan, who's 20 years old, and he was from Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, which is actually where my friend Lori lives. If you're listening to this, hi girl, hi. And I guess they met outside a pub. He was being threatened by two other men, and Nilsen intervened in the altercation and took Gallican to his room at the where he lived, I guess, at the time, in North London. And the two men spent the evening drinking and talking, and Nilsen learned that Gallican had recently moved to London and was gay, unemployed, and resided in a hostel. So the following morning, both men agreed to live together in a larger residence, and Nilsen, using part of an inheritance bequeathed to him by his father, helped find a larger property, and they viewed a vacant ground floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue, also in Cricklewood, and decided to move into the property. And before they did so, Nilsen negotiated a deal with the landlord where he and Gallican had exclusive use of the garden at the rear of the property. And that was important because when he moved to the new apartment, he no longer had access to a garden.
So he couldn't build a bonfire.
No, nor could he bury parts temporarily. He didn't have the ability to carry on and do whatever he needed to do without being bothered, right? So basically, they had a very bizarre relationship, and eventually they broke up. It's hard to say that they broke up because they didn't really have a romantic relationship. They lived together, but they very seldomly had intercourse. They brought home other men, and I guess they had a heated argument, and by 1977, Gillican left, with one saying that it was he caused the breakup and Nilsen saying that he caused the breakup, which is... I have so many friends, couples, who are like, no, I dumped him. No, I dumped her. No, I dumped him.
Oh yeah.
You have to be the dumper and not the dumpy. And I just thought that was such a human moment.
Yeah.
So he had been there since 1975. And then he'd been there alone since 1977. So by 78, he was alone. He experienced at least 3 failed relationships in the previous 18 months, and he later confessed to having developed an increasing conviction that he was unfit to live with. And throughout 1978, he devoted an ever-increasing amount of time, effort, and assiduity to his work. And most evenings he spent drinking and listening to music. So you can kind of see, right before, 1978, the events leading up to when he was so isolated and so convinced that his presence was intolerable to others, that he would be alone.
Yeah.
That you can kind of see where his almost borderline irrational fear of abandonment by the men who had been with him only temporarily kind of comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when he moved to 23 Cranley Gardens, Nilsen had no access to a garden, and as he resided in an attic flat, he was unable to stow any bodies beneath his floorboards. So for about I think I've been calling the first one the attic flat. It's the second one that's the attic flat, which makes sense because I did say that he's on the 3rd floor. So I guess in the first place he was on the 1st floor, which makes sense. And because when he pulled out one of the bodies, he said it was covered in dirt, which now makes sense. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Sometimes I'm a little dumb, and every time that I'm a little dumb, we just take a shot. Drinking game. A new drinking game. So, for almost 2 months, any acquaintances that Nilsen encountered and lured to his flat were not assaulted in any manner, although he did attempt to strangle a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobbs in November, but he stopped himself from completing the act. That is cited in later pages of Coffee's book, but I don't have access to later pages. I only have like a beginning excerpt. Thank you, Amazon. So in March of 1982, Nilsen encountered 23-year-old John Howlett while drinking in a pub near, Leicester Square. Howlett was lured to Nilsen's flat on the promise of continuing drinking with Nilsen, and there both Nilsen and Howlett drank as they watched a movie before Howlett walked into Nilsen's front room and fell asleep in the bed, which was located in the front room at that time. An hour later, Nilsen unsuccessfully attempted to rouse Howlett, then sat on the edge of the bed drinking rum as he stared at him before deciding to kill him. Okay, so after a ferocious struggle in which Howlett attempted to strangle Nilsen, Nilsen strangled Howlett into unconsciousness with an upholstery strap before returning to his living room, shaking from the stress of in which he believed he would be overpowered. Over the next 10 minutes, Howlett's unconscious in the other room. He tries 3 different times unsuccessfully to kill him after noticing that he's resumed breathing before deciding to just fill his bathtub with water and drown him.
As you do.
Yeah. For over a week following Howlett's murder, Nilsen's own neck, Howlett's finger impressions, which is just insane. And then in May of 1982, Nilsen encountered in May of 1982, so 2 to 3 months after the murder of John Howlett, Nilsen encountered Carl Stodor, a 21-year-old gay man, as Carl was drinking at the Black Cap pub in Camden. Nilsen engaged him in conversation and discovered that he was depressed following a failed relationship. After plying him with alcohol, Nilsen invited Stodor to his flat and assured his guest that he had no intention of sexual activity, which I think we can all agree was the least of his concerns.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Once at the apartment, Stodor drank more alcohol and then fell asleep on an open sleeping bag, and he later awoke to find himself being strangled with Nilsen loudly whispering, "Stay still!" which is fucking terrifying.
Yeah, that's sleep paralysis kind of.
Horror, yeah.
Yeah.
In his subsequent testimony at Nilsen's trial, Stodor stated he initially believed that Nilsen was trying to free him from the zipper of the sleeping bag before he returned to a state of unconsciousness, and he then vaguely recalled hearing running water before realizing he was immersed in water and that Nilsen was attempting to drown him. After briefly succeeding in raising his head above the water, Stodor gasped the words, "No more, please, no more," before Nilsen again submerged Stodor's head beneath the water. Believing he'd killed Stodor, Nilsen seated the youth in his armchair, then noted Bleep licking Stodor's face. Nilsen realized that Stodor was still alive, so he rubbed his arms and legs to increase circulation, covered him in blankets, and laid him upon the bed. And when Stodor regained consciousness, Nilsen embraced him and explained to him that he had almost strangled himself on the zip of the sleeping bag and that he had resuscitated him. Over the following 2 days, Stodor repeatedly lapsed in and out of consciousness, and when he had gained enough strength to question Nilsen as to his recollections of being strangled and immersed in cold water, Nilsen explained that as he had become caught in the zip of the sleeping bag following a nightmare, he had then placed him in cold water because he was in shock. And then Nilsen led Stodor to a nearby railway station where he informed him that he hoped they might meet again before bidding him farewell.
Huh.
Yeah. It's not the first time that he had strangled someone and then immediately regretted it and tried to resuscitate them. He just simply failed previously.
Yeah.
3 months after Nilsen's June 1982 promotion to the position of executive officer in his employment, he encountered a 27-year-old named Graham Allen attempting to hail a taxi in Shaftesbury Avenue. Shaftesbury? Allen accepted Nilsen's offer to accompany him to Cranley Gardens for a meal. As had been the case with several previous victims, Nilsen stated he could not recall the precise moment that he had strangled Allen, but he recalled approaching him as he sat eating an omelet with the full intention of murdering him. Okay.
Wow.
Like, what the fuck? That's kind of weird because all of the others were asleep or unconscious when he attacked them. So the fact that this guy's just sitting there eating a fucking omelet is like...
Yeah, and he also, I mean, he did ply them, with promises of meals, but it was also alcohol in a lot of cases.
Yeah, they were often drunk, yeah.
Yeah.
Allen's body was retained in the bathtub for a total of 3 days before Nilsen began the task of dissecting his body upon the kitchen floor. Nilsen is again known to have informed his employers that he was ill and unable to work on 9th of October, and likely in order that he could complete the dissection of Allen's body. And then on the 26th of January in 1983, we know that Nilsen killed his final victim, 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair.
Well, he certainly isn't lacking in variety.
What do you mean?
Well...
Oh, that he had a lot of victims? Yes.
He had a lot of victims. He also had a lot of different...
But they all pretty much fall into the same description. They were smaller, fair men, slight of build, and typically very pallid in complexion. I mean, he's got a type.
It's the murders he does not commit are some of the most fascinating, because the level of manipulation it takes to convince somebody who saw you trying to murder them twice, and them saying...
I mean, he was unconscious, though, so who knows how much he would remember, or...
Yeah.
So who knows how much, he would remember or have even perceived to begin with,
Yeah.
He could have maybe just been like, what is happening?
Yeah. I mean, and so many of the things where he was talking about not remembering exactly when he had killed certain victims.
No, I was talking... You were saying that the level of manipulation that it takes to convince somebody that, just witnessed you twice try to kill them, that they were really resuscitating you. And I was saying, but yeah, he was unconscious at the time.
Oh,
so who knows how much his victim remembered.
Yeah. No, you're right. And that's...
Dennis not having remembered anything does not do anything in his favor. You can't just be like, oh, well, I don't remember strangling you, so it must not have happened.
Right, no,
exactly. I haven't seen it, it's new to me.
If my eyes are closed while I'm doing it, it doesn't count.
I'm invisible.
I can't see you and you can't see me. No.
But yeah, I don't necessarily know that it was like... You are literally correct when you say that it was a manipulation. He is manipulating someone into something else, but I don't think that he was doing it like...
No, he's not over there with a finger pyramid going,
Yeah, it was his intense ambivalence and his intense sudden regret, and he was like, now he was invested in this guy living, so he had to tell him something, and so he just... I don't know, man. You had a nightmare and got stuck in this zipper and it was bad. And then I had to throw you in a bathtub because you were in shock. That's what you got to do. That's what it says. I Googled it. You know?
Have you seen the state of zippers today, mate? Yeah. The zipper.
He's Scottish. That's not even, I don't, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. As you should be.
Yeah.
But yeah. Poor kid.
Yeah.
It's a very bizarre case, but it's one that I find to be. I honestly, I kind of categorize Dennis Nilsen in a very rare category of serial killers in which I have also placed only one other killer, and that is Ed Kemper. Because I think that they both genuinely did not understand what the fuck they were, like, why they were doing any of the things that they were doing, but wanted to know.
Yeah.
I think that they also both wanted to stop. I mean, Kemper pretty much turned himself into the police. And I think that, I mean, they were both in a position where they couldn't run anymore, but I also think they were both in a position where they were coming apart at the seams. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you see it in a lot with Nilsen, where him losing that setup that he had with the ground floor flat, the exclusive garden access, and the neighbors who don't mind the occasional tire fire.
Yep.
Like, him losing that flat and having to move to Cranley Gardens was
the beginning of the end.
Yeah, 100%.
But I guess if we're gonna start psychoanalyzing the guy,
we should move to segment 2.
Part 2 of our show.
Listener, we're gonna take a quick break here, and we're gonna start part 2, the psychoanalysis portion of the podcast.
It's 8:00 p.m. Do you know where your podcast is? Why, it's over on patreon.com/KTMY podcast. For only $3 a month, you get access to our bonus episodes as well as monthly Patreon exclusive Q&As. You can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook at KTMY Podcast, or on Twitter at KTMY Pod. Send us questions, letters, anything else at ktmypodcast@gmail.com or on our website at ktmypodcast.com.
What a refreshing break, Brian. I feel refreshed. Do you feel refreshed?
Like a lime sorbet, my palate is cleansed. And here we are for segment 2.
Like a flower covered in morning dew. All right. So, okay.
Like an overwrought simile.
So these are the days of our lives. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23rd of 1945. He was the son of Norwegian soldier Olav Magnus Nilsen and Betty White, not that Betty White, in a district household in Fraserburgh, a small fishing village in the heart of Aberdeenshire, Scotland. I am getting this information from a 2002 article by Paul Sutherland. I didn't check to see where this article was from. I don't know, but that's who wrote it. Nilsen's father showed very little interest in his family and spent the majority of his time away until he finally just deserted them, like, officially, when Dennis was only 6 years old. By this time, Nilsen says that the first 5 years were the happiest times of his life, and it's because he spent them with his grandfather, Andrew White, his maternal grandfather, who he just adored. He just loved him more than anyone else in the world. Andrew White was a strict man, sullen and proud, and disapproved of such things as alcohol, the radio, and working on the Sabbath. It's a man with real priorities. All right.
The evil pyramid.
Mm-hmm. That's truly the things you need to look out for in life.
I don't want my grandchildren listening to that little orphan Annie might give them ideas.
Again, they're Scottish, Brian. What is
I
so
know.
hard for you about them being Scottish?
The
Really?
Scottish accent, probably. I'm not very good at it. It all just comes out as a Gimli.
You've tried like a posh London accent. You've
Yeah.
tried like, now you're doing just the American South.
Yeah. It's like West Virginia is kind of what I was heading for.
Anyway, Andrew White seemed to find a real contentment and joy in his relationship with his grandson, and the two would go off walking for hours on end, with Nilsen listening to his grandfather's tales of the sea. His grandfather was a fisherman, I believe, of some sort.
Mm.
But
not on Sundays.
That's correct. But eventually, on Halloween Day of 1951, White was found dead in his fishing boat. So his closest relationship, Nilsen was 6 years old at the time. His grandfather was only 62. And very suddenly, his grandfather is just boom dead. And he was not told that his grandfather was dead. He was told that he was just sleeping.
Oh.
This brings us to our KTMY safety tip of the week. Teach your children about death. Don't be fucking weird about it. Because if you're fucking weird about it, they're going to be fucking weird about it.
They're
and that
going
might
to be
cute when they're
weirder.
tiny, but when they grow up, it gets real weird real quick.
Yeah, like however weird you are with your kid about whatever topic, they're going to take it to the next level because that's what kids do. So,
Yeah, kids are hardcore, man.
Frank, honest discussion, compassionate, obviously, sensitive for their understanding, but like,
yes,
Grandpa's not sleeping in his boat.
I don't think they told him that he was sleeping in the boat.
Oh, well.
They told him that he was just sleeping. And he was shown his grandfather lying in his coffin. So I can't imagine that they then, like, dragged the boat in for the wake. You know what I mean? Like, that's...
Maybe
seems a bit much.
I don't know how much he loved that boat.
It was my favoriteest boat. So, Nilsen himself claims that, seeing his grandfather lying dead in his coffin is his most vivid childhood memory. Mm. And it's very clear that this was a very significant early exposure to death and to a dead body for Nilsen that had a great impact on his life.
Like the impact.
Yes. And it was very traumatizing for him to finally realize after waiting for months that his grandfather wasn't gonna come back.
Yeah. He's not waking up.
So here we see the very clear onset of abandonment issues.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Sutherland writes that it can be argued that this psychological bombshell hurled Nilsen into his world of loneliness, and that he would never again love another person healthily or wholeheartedly after his grandfather's death. It is unfair to say that Nilsen did not have an ordinary childhood. Indeed, he developed a fondness for animals that he would carry throughout his life. Nilsen kept pigeons and was devastated when a vandal slaughtered them for no reason, which I feel like probably has to add to his whole, like, everyone's gonna die, they're gonna do it suddenly, everyone you love, ha ha ha.
Yeah.
Feeling, which, probably became like a manic kind of, how when someone's gonna break up with you, so you break up with them first?
Yeah, or when you're like, you feel, it's like, you can't fire me, I quit!
No, not like that. Not like out of spite. I mean, like, when you can feel that this person is gonna break up with you, and they're just drawing it out, and you just want to know it's gonna happen.
Off yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're just like, can we have done with this charade, this charade, right. And
Yeah.
you're just like, yeah. So I feel like that's kind of maybe his like, oh my god, this person's gonna die and leave me. Quick, I better murder them. You know?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
I better beat death to the punch. You can't sneak up on me, death. You can't catch me, gay thoughts. Um, so I don't know, just a theory.
Mhm.
Nilsen also inherited an obsession with the sea from his grandfather, and he spent hours along the shore or writing about the sea. He remained, as Sutherland writes, sexually uninitiated at school, although he felt urges at times. This is perhaps one of the most awkward sentences I think I've ever read in my life, Brian. And
Yeah,
I'm
like,
curious to know how Paul Sutherland has come to this conclusion. How do you know that
yeah,
he was sexually uninitiated? Why would you phrase it like that ever? And why would
yeah,
you then add,
it's
although
not
he
a
felt
club.
urges at times? Like, it's not a club.
Well, he
Maybe
hasn't
it was
done.
in the 80s.
Listen, man, that's very awkward phrasing, Paul.
The whole thing is just real. Like, why would you talk about his virginity? First of all, virginity is fake. It's a social construct. It isn't real. And why would you add that he felt urges at times? First of
It's
all, how
like,
would you know? Second of all, why would you feel the need to inform us?
first of all, you're telling me.
That's puberty.
No, hold on. You're telling me a teenager has urges? Perish the thought. Like that's what puberty does to people. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it is assumed when you are talking about a teenager.
Well, Sutherland felt we ought to know. Apparently. So at one point, Nilsen became infatuated with the son of a local minister. And another fantasy figure that he had was a character in a French grammar book named Pierre Duvin. Nilsen's schooling was apparently unremarkable and led to him opting to join the army at the age of 15.
Wow.
Which is like, why are you taking children
Yeah,
at the age
number
of 15?
one.
Like, what is this, the Sudan? You don't need to be taking children in the army.
No.
Fuck.
Like, World War II just ended. You don't have...
All right, well, it gets worse.
As always on Knife to Meet You, listeners, it gets worse.
So Nilsen's first 3 years in the army were spent undergoing training at the depot, Aldershot Barracks in southern England. And he describes this as an unusually happy time. He thrived on the hard work, discipline, and comradeship of army life. And he reveled in the feeling that he was no longer an outsider. But he did struggle with the fact that he was sexually attracted to some of his comrades. And that was, something that was kind of always part of like the undercurrent, like the underlying experience that he was having.
Right.
At this time, he had many sexual encounters with men, as well as with a Bavarian sex worker and a young Arab boy. I don't feel like that's the right way to describe someone, but okay.
Yeah.
Sutherland's just making this as awkward for us as possible, and I want you to know he did not use the term sex worker. So,
Yeah.
It was while he was serving in the Middle East that Nilsen's disturbing fascination with seeing himself as a corpse began to grow. He would apparently cover himself with talcum powder, blew his lips somehow, and then masturbate while looking at himself. So he had apparently some kind of weird overlap between love and death in his mind, according to Paul Sutherland's account here.
Right. Some kind of auto-necrophilia.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Well phrased.
Thank you.
Take a note, Sutherland. Anyway, so, okay, towards the end of his army career, Nilsen had attained the rank of corporal and received a posting to the Shetland Islands, where he fell in love with an 18-year-old private, but the feelings were unrequited, so Nilsen kept them to himself. But he was devastated about it. And on his last night in the Shetlands, he burned hundreds of movie films that the pair had made together, which was very surprising to many of his colleagues. In total, his army career lasted 11 years and 3 months. And he had the offer of a very rewarding career to continue with the army. But he was, by that time, disillusioned with the army's participation in Northern Ireland and left the army bitter about the politics of the time, which he was actually, I've read a bit about his politics. He was a socialist, and I agree with a lot of the things that he had to say. So he left the army. He returned to Fraserburgh for about 5 weeks after he demobbed. I don't know what that means. I assume that's an army term, like debriefed. I don't know.
He demobilized, maybe?
Maybe. Or maybe there was a flash mob that he had to leave. Find someone to replace him. So he returned to the house that he grew up in, and his mother Betty had by then remarried and lived with her second husband, named Adam Scott. While he was there, Nilsen had a furious row with his brother over the subject of homosexuality, and it was apparently so severe that the two never spoke again.
Wow.
Yeah. So clearly there was some very homophobic issues within his family that very likely added to his feelings of rejection and abandonment and feeling unlovable and all of the things that made him feel like he had to kill people just to have someone to sit and watch TV with. Oof. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, in December of 1972, Nilsen enrolled in the Metropolitan Police because he hoped that joining the police would kind of recapture some of the camaraderie he'd felt within the army. He was given the number Q287 was his police number. But he found that police life was a very poor substitute and that he was left in his own company for his off-duty period, so he was still alone all the time. And he just kind of didn't like it. Around this time, he'd become a regular in London's gay bars, namely the bars such as King William IV, the Colerne, a bar that was exploited for later use by serial killer Colin Ireland, the Golden Lion, the Black Cap, the Salisbury, and the Cricklewood Arms. Say what you will about London, but they can name a fucking bar.
Oh, they can name bars all day long.
It's so good. Whenever I have to name like a tavern in like a fantasy setting, I always name it the same thing because coming up with a bar is so difficult and I've only got like one funny name.
What do you got?
The One-Legged Trout. Excellent fantasy tavern name. You guys can use it. You have my full permission. I don't even think I came up with it. I think my brother came up with that one. But anyway. So, 1974, Nilsen is cruising the gay bars, cruising the gay scene. And he's always looking for company. And, it's around then that he meets David Gallican, who we talked about earlier. He stepped in when Gallican was going to get into a fight and he, rescued him.
Yeah.
And then they spent the night drinking and then decided to become roommates because Gallican was basically fucking homeless. So, they went flat hunting and then, obviously, decided to stay at 195 Melrose Avenue.
Right.
And they were happy together for 2 years, although that's not true according to Russell Coffee's explanation of it. I think it was that we were discussing earlier. But I don't know. Russell Coffee is clearly a virulent homophobic, so perhaps he does not believe that the gays can be happy. I'm very happy. I'm very happy, Russell, and I want you to know that. She says while maintaining very intense eye contact with him. To assert my gay dominance. So, when their relationship fell apart and the relationship kind of, came to an end, Nilsen attempted to fill the void created by Gallican leaving by throwing himself into work and renewing his rounds at the gay bars, and just, drinking a metric ton. And it's a metric ton because this is London. As 1978 drew to a close, Nilsen sank into a deep depression after he spent the Christmas holidays alone in his flat. And that's when the killings began.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we've come fully round circle to where I started our story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I feel like we now have a very complete understanding of Nilsen and his life and how we got to where he was.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I want to say, just in the guise of complete transparency, we did have to record part 2 of this episode once before. It was a while ago. I don't really remember it, but the recording quality was so bad that we literally we couldn't use it. It was unusable.
It might as well not exist.
Yeah. But I do remember, of all of the things that we talked about, that Brian had made an incredibly poignant observation about the theme of, water in his life. And I remember that you drew a parallel from his grandfather's death to his autobiography, The Diary of a Drowning Boy.
Yeah.
And kind of this feeling of pervasive, and then the fact that he did drown some victims. And I feel like you made another point in addition to those, but I can't now remember what it was.
Right, because listeners, just we mentioned this once or twice, but we do a lot of these recordings in advance. So this recording that we did was at least 2 months ago.
Yeah.
But I do recall a bit of what Zoe's saying, and it is really interesting to me how much of his life and how much of the tragedy of his life revolves around water.
Yeah.
And especially when water was something that he loved so much because his grandfather was a fisherman. He loved spending time fishing with his grandpa. So to have, so many things like that stolen at such a young age, because he's the drowning boy. He's always in it.
And the sea is such a metaphor, though. Always, I think, particularly for loneliness.
Yeah.
This is such like an obscure and specific reference. But do you remember the TV show The West Wing?
Yeah, of course.
And you remember Martin Sheen? He played the president on The West Wing.
He sure did.
And I think when he played the president on The West Wing, in his office, and in his Oval Office, he had like a plaque or something that had an engraved quote on it, and it was like, it was a quote about God or something, but what it said was like, I have to put my trust in you because your ocean is so large and my boat is so small.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes me, I thought of that when I was thinking like of Dennis Nilsen and the ocean and his loneliness and all of these things.
Yeah, there's also there's a bit of Shakespeare from the Comedy of Errors, where it says, "I to the world am like a drop of water that in the ocean seeks another drop, who failing there to find his fellow forth, unseen, inquisitive, confounds himself." And I've always thought about that as whenever I think about loneliness. Because that's what it is. That's what it feels like. It feels like there's that you're looking for that other tiny bit, and I think water is such a good metaphor for yes, unity, but also for distance and separation and endlessness.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not crying, you're crying. I just have something in my eye, like a twig or a branch. Um,
What is this, a ficus?
So I think that it's very clear that Dennis Nilsen does not hit any of the points on the McDonald triad.
Yeah.
No record of him wetting the bed, and there's a pretty detailed record of his childhood. I mean, we know he had pet pigeons, for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
So no animal cruelty. He's,
He loved animals, yeah.
Yeah. And no setting fires or any of that shit.
Nope.
So if we want to run the PCLR, we can.
Absolutely. I will keep tally.
All right. Tally ho then. Glib and superficial charm. I don't find him superficially charming. I think he's just kind of him.
He's just very matter of fact about things, yeah.
Yeah, he's not putting on any pretense.
Yeah.
I'd put a 0 there. I'd also put a 0 down for grandiose estimation of self, because I think his self-esteem was in the fucking toilet.
Yeah.
No pun intended. Oof. Just
Oof.
realized that was very poorly worded. Sorry about that. It was not my intention. I just mean that he thought very, very poorly of himself. And
yes.
It was his thorough belief that he was not lovable that made him feel that everyone would eventually come to abandon him.
Right. His estimation of self was as about as low as it could be.
Yeah. I actually would not even put down need for stimulation or pathological lying, because we've no evidence of that at all.
Yeah.
I couldn't even put down 2 for lack of remorse or guilt, because the guy was full of remorse and guilt.
Right. He wanted
the point that he was spitting at his reflection and hitting himself, and he couldn't reconcile how much he hated himself, and what he was doing, and which I'm sure then only made it more clear in his mind that nobody could ever love him, because he was also now a murderer, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think he had a shallow affect. I think he had a very full affect, actually.
Well, yeah, he was, no accounts of him being a weird, mysterious loner or anything like that. He seemed to know his neighbors. They seemed to be aware of him, at least.
Actually, his neighbors thought of him as a weird, mysterious loner, so...
Well, look at me being dumb.
I mean, I said it in the first part, but the thing is, he was alone because he didn't think anyone wanted to be with him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this was following, the falling out with his family and his partner of 2 years leaving him, and
it's all compounding.
Yeah. I feel like instead of murdering 15 men, he should have just gotten 15 cats. And maybe another dog or 2.
Yeah. Maybe a blip for Bleep to play with.
Yeah, Blip and Bleep. Oh, that would have been adorable. This could have been a much cuter episode. I don't see parasitic lifestyle. He held a job. He paid his bills.
Hey, he was in the army. He tried being a policeman. He only stopped doing it because he didn't like it.
Yeah, he held his political views were even not parasitic. He believed that the government should take care of its people.
Yeah.
So, all right. Maybe we could put down a 2 for poor behavioral controls.
Yeah.
Maybe a 2 under sexual promiscuity, but I honestly, who the fuck are we to judge his sex life?
Yeah, and also, under their definition, right, promiscuity is many partners in an abnormal situation, but that's not abnormal if you don't make it abnormal, right? It's not like infidelity.
I mean, I don't know. Let's just not even address it. Let's just skip that one.
Okay. We're at 2 points.
Early behavioral problems? No, he didn't have any. Even after a good and lonely kid.
Yeah.
Lack of realistic long-term goals. I'd say he had some very good long-term goals. He had multiple career prospects.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he could have been a lifelong soldier. He could have been
Yeah, he made it to the rank of corporal, which is
yeah, he could have been
above the rank of regular soldier.
he could have done that forever. He had options. He didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. He definitely had.
You could put 2 points in impulsivity, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't put any points in irresponsibility. I wouldn't put any points in failure to accept responsibility for his own actions, because he did. He owned up from the beginning.
And that exactly, because
Yeah.
they expected 2, maybe 3.
Yeah.
And he just he handed them everything he had.
Nah, dude, I'm done. I'm just gonna tell you everything.
Yeah.
Buckle up. You know?
Well, we're already driving, so hopefully you are buckled up.
Right. Many short-term marital relationships. He was never married.
Yeah.
And you know, I don't know. No juvenile delinquency. He was never arrested, so no revocation. Well, I mean, he was eventually arrested, but I mean, like, he didn't have a series of arrests like many of our other people. So no violation of parole, no revocation of conditional release, and no criminal versatility.
Yeah.
I don't really know that Dennis Nilsen was a psychopath, Brian. And that's kind of what's even more terrifying.
Yeah.
Because it's like, now what does that teach us? What are we learning from this shit? You know?
Yeah, and he never claimed like hallucination or anything like that.
No, he was pretty lucid.
Yeah.
I don't even know what to say about this.
That's the conclusion for this episode, listeners. Life is spooky. Like that's pretty much what I have.
Nothing is homogenized. We can't put anything in a category. Everything you believe is real is literally just a hallucination. Thank you and good night.
Especially this show. Ooh.
Right? We are all meat popsicles on a flying rock. I don't know what to tell you. We are all piloting meat mechs using the hallucinations and the jelly that is our brain.
Yeah. And, listen. Some days our meat mechs don't do so good. So take care of your meat mech, listener. Rest up now and then if you need it. Put your meat mech in for servicing.
I would prefer that we stop this joke now. It is getting gross. Well, I guess what we can learn from this is that a lonely life is a dangerous one, I guess. And just take care of each other out there.
Yeah.
And love each other, and if you're really lonely, get more animals and maybe start listening to podcasts. I don't know.
Keep listening to podcasts, especially our podcast. Who said you can listen to other podcasts?
Now, Brian, you don't want to be possessive and jealous. The story of Dennis Nilsen is so sad. Like, I don't have it in me to hate him the way that I do many of our other killers. And, it's just a really sad story.
Yeah. And I think part of what makes it, again, scary is that it's sad.
Yeah.
Because it's like...
And that it's just not part of the normal script, that we expect.
Yeah.
Based on prior experience and previous episodes. And it's just a very bizarre happenstance. I don't know what we're expected from the universe to take away from this, but maybe just be kind to one another.
Yeah. Yeah. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Make sure that you stay kind to yourself and everyone else. Reach out to someone if you think they might be lonely.
Yeah.
Because there's a never-ending supply of people who feel that way, and we can do something about it.
Yeah, and even if you feel like you've got nothing to talk about with them, you can always watch Harry Potter together, you know?
It's true. Who doesn't like the especially those first two? Just such tight direction, that excellent John Williams score, it's great.
Yeah. Um until next week, guys, it's been so nice to meet you. Have a good
Bye.
one. Bye.